Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode in our series on the last night on the Titanic. We're looking at the cast of characters who were there on the fateful night the Titanic went down. And then we're also looking at aspects of the culture on the Titanic that go beyond just the different classes, the workers, the vendors, the cooks, those who made the Titanic what it was, and delving more into their story. So as always, I'm here with Veronica Inke. Veronica, how are you doing?
I'm doing well.
All right. Someone we're going to look at, well, a genre of people we're going to look at, I think is going to be very interesting. And we're going to look at writers on the Titanic. And this isn't something I really ever thought of or considered, but it makes perfect sense that there would have been writers. Before we get into them, there's something I'm curious about. Did the writers who were on the Titanic really contribute to the crafting of the narrative that we know about the Titanic today? Or was it other people? How did they contribute to this story?
Yes, Scott, actually, there were several journalists on board, and journalist Lawrence Beesley was on board in second class on the Titanic, and he published his account of that last night aboard the Titanic in his book, The Loss of the SS Titanic. Many brave things were done that night, he wrote, but none were more brave than those done by men playing minute after minute as the ship settled quietly lower and lower in the sea. The music they played served like their own immortal requiem and their right to be recalled in the scrolls of undying fame. And what he was talking about there, Scott, was the band playing on, which is such a huge piece of the Titanic story as we know it today. So you really nailed it with that question, because so much of what we know of that night was handed down to us by people like Lawrence Beesley and other journalists. There was a female journalist who was a columnist for Women's Wear Daily. She had just been in Paris covering the Easter Sunday races for the magazine, and she was known to talk quite a lot to reporters when she returned to the United States, and she shared a lot of information about that last night on the Titanic. Her version of what happened with the band is quite different than Lawrence Beesley's. She insisted that she would be surprised that any band would play a song like Nearer My God to Thee, when that would have caused a panic and would not have set a really positive tone for people who were, faced with that great disaster that night. So there's quite a bit of back and forth about that. And we cover that in the book in a chapter about, did the band play on?
Right. And that's a good point, because I think that the event of the sinking of the Titanic, it would have been significant no matter what happened, because of such a huge loss of life at one time and what the Titanic symbolized as this so-called unsinkable ship. But because there are these romantic elements that were so quickly tied into it, like the band playing on, and we're arguing about, did it happen? Did it not happen? Did it happen the way we remember it? We at least remember it because of these stories that are told. So it still takes on this romantic element. And we're talking about it now when there's no one alive who's a survivor. Do I have that right? Are there any survivors still alive?
You have that right. The last survivor passed away many years ago, and she was just a baby when she was aboard the Titanic.
Right. And so this is something that is 4 or 5 generations ago. This is pre-World War I. There really is something to say that those who added these features and poetic elements to what the sinking meant really did their job well. So I'd like to get into more of these people that you've profiled and chronicled and hear their story. The first is Paul Danby. So tell us about Paul Danby and why he was significant and what his story was with the Titanic.
Sure. So Paul Danby was actually not a passenger aboard the Titanic, but he actually wrote the letter that was mailed from the Titanic, the first letter mailed from the Titanic. He was seeing off his wife's uncle, Adolphe Saalfeld, who was a first-class passenger. He was seeing him off in Southampton. The Titanic sailed from Southampton and, made 2 stops before she head out across the Atlantic Ocean, 2 stops after that. So this was her first stop where a great majority of the passengers boarded. And one of them was Paul Danby's uncle, Adolphe Saalfeld. And he is interesting in his own right in that he wrote an amazing letter as well. We'll talk about him in a little bit. And he was also in recent news stories because vials of perfumes that he was carrying to the United States to start a new entrepreneurial business were discovered at the wreck site intact. And there were all sorts of different vials that were labeled Geranus and Carnation, Pergonal, all the different types of fragrances that you would imagine a perfume entrepreneur would be carrying. But on that first day, his nephew by his wife, his niece's husband, Paul Danby, was seeing him off, and they both sat down and wrote letters together. And Paul wrote to his wife that he was on this incredible ship and so excited to see Uncle off, and talked about what the ship looked like, how majestic it was, how exciting it was. And it impressed him so much that he even took a few minutes to have a little fun with it and sat down and took out some stationery and wanted to be sure to send something from the Titanic before he disembarked when the Titanic sailed away without him. So in a way, he survived the Titanic by stepping off. And some 30 years later, he lost his life in the Holocaust at Sobibor concentration camp. He was deported by the Nazis, he and his wife. And it's a really heart-wrenching story that I was so fortunate to discover because it made me see the connection between the Titanic and the Holocaust, which is profound. His granddaughter, Petra Burka, was the 1965 world figure skating champion, but a lot happened in between the 1940s and 1965. Paul and his whole family were deported to concentration camps. One of his daughters was able to go into hiding, and so she was not included in that. But when he and his wife were sent to Sobibor, his daughter, Petra's mother, was in a work camp she had been assigned to a work camp that was led by the Nazis, and she was out picking peat moss off the ground. A really nasty job where you're digging peat moss and on your hands and knees all day. And someone came to her and said, "You have a few minutes to go and see your parents being sent away, and you have to come right back after just a few minutes." And one of the most memorable stories in my research is this one about how she went to the train station. Her name was Ellen, and she was a young woman at the time, and she could see her parents in the doorway of the car and of the train car, and they stood there looking at each other, the three of them, for a while. And then her mother went into the train car and left the doorway, but her father stayed there. And then it got to the point where she couldn't wait there any longer, and she knew she had to turn around and go back to working in the field pulling the peat moss. And when I heard this story, I just thought how amazing it is, how the Titanic just has such a far reach that it even has ties to the stories that are just so incredible in our world history, like the Holocaust.
Yeah, I mean, with all the survivors, they're like what we talked about in a previous episode. Many of them are showing up on the battlefields of World War I, probably many in World War II as officers, here as victims of the Holocaust and many other places. So it really spreads out from here in 1912 when this happens.
Right. That was one of the most inspiring things to me as I did this research was how amazingly so many of these people went on from surviving that horrific tragedy to just going through more and more things that were trying circumstances like you wouldn't believe. And we talked about that already with Baker Charles Jochen. There's so many examples of that. And this is definitely one of those.
Well, somebody else that was connected to Paul Danby, we just touched on Adolphe Saalfeld a little bit, but can you talk a little bit more? You mentioned the perfume vials that were found. With Saalfeld, something that you mentioned is that there was a sense of survivor guilt that happened with him. So could you talk about that?
So, as you know, in those days, it was women and children first, and that was strictly enforced by officers and passengers and crew alike. And in the case of many of these survivors, even when they survived, they didn't really survive because they were racked with the guilt and the scorn that they faced publicly when they returned home. In the case of Adolphe Saalfeld, he saw a lifeboat that hardly anyone was in, and there were no women around that were hoping to get into it. And so he boarded the lifeboat like, so many of us would have done. And he, for many years, had a terrible time trying to sleep after the Titanic. There were so many different instances of people who, one couple even had to move out of the city of Minneapolis and move to the suburbs because, as their great nephew told me, they were just racked with the memories of those noises and sounds of that night for the rest of their lives. They, the ambulances of the city and all the sights and sounds of the city, they really just could live without. So they went to the suburbs. And in the case of people like Adolphe Saalfeld, it was the survivor guilt that affected them as well as those other feelings and so forth. And all of that combined just made life very difficult for Adolphe. When he returned home to London, he would even need, sometimes on really bad nights, his trusted chauffeur, Patch, called him Patch, who, that was his nickname. He had been with him for years. He would turn to him to have to drive him through the streets of London, the dark, often dreary, rainy streets of London, to help him fall asleep, or he wouldn't be able to fall asleep. It was that bad. So, and many people, remarked that he looked like a much older man when he passed away than he actually was. Adolphe is really special in my research because up until I started researching for The Last Night on the Titanic, Scott, I was, just mostly familiar with that last menu in first class on April 14th, the last night on the Titanic. And then when I started delving into this further about other foods and menu items that were aboard the Titanic, I looked to things like letters and menus that were saved that weren't as maybe famous or popular as that last first class dinner menu was. And one of the letters I found, and something that really sparked my tenacity to keep going with this, was the letter that Adolphe wrote to his wife Gertrude on the day he boarded. He boarded in Southampton with his niece's husband, Paul Danby. He saw him off there, and then he took a nap. He had lunch, took a nap, did all the kinds of things we would do on our first day getting settled into a big ship like the Titanic. And he wrote about how there was hot and cold running water in his cabin. He told his wife all about this big lunch he had eaten. He had soup, fillet of plaice, which is a flounder-like fish. It's a lot like flounder. A loin chop with cauliflower. He had fried potatoes, and he ate an apple Manhattan for dessert, some Roquefort cheese, and then he said he washed it all down with a Spaten beer iced. And that's really interesting because one of the things we know for sure is that Wrexham Lager was one of the suppliers for the Titanic, and they supplied the beer, Wrexham Lager, which is a Munich draft. And we can assume that that was probably what Adolphe was talking about in his letter to his wife, Gertrude. And he also told her that he took a long walk. He called it a promenade, and dozed for an hour until about 5 p.m. He said the band played in the afternoon for tea. But